Nobody at Fells Point Market knew her real name. To them, she was just a homeless ghost in a faded hoodie, living behind the bakery dumpster. But on a rainy Saturday morning, when 20 bystanders turned a blind eye as 2 young men harassed a helpless old woman, this nameless stranger stepped in. She took a brutal beating, falling 3 times onto the wet bricks, using her own body as a shield. She had no idea the old woman was Rosa Koval, or that her son, August Koval, was the most feared man in the city's ports. And as she lay bleeding in the mud, she didn't know the terrifying truth. August had been searching for a nurse named Delaney Whitcomb for years, believing she was responsible for his brother's death. When August's black cars arrived and he knelt in the filthy water beside her, he expected to find a ruthless enemy. Instead, through a bloody mouth, her only words were a plea to check his mother's injured wrist. If this is the kind of story that stays with you, go ahead and hit that like button so more people can find it. Share it with somebody who still believes ordinary folks can do extraordinary things. And subscribe to the channel, because we tell one of these every week, and you're not going to want to miss the next one. Now let's go back to that rainy Saturday morning, and let's start where it really started, with a loaf of bread on a windowsill. The smell of baking dough always arrived before the light. It slipped through the cracks in the brick wall behind the bakery, threaded its way down the narrow space between the wall and the garbage cans, and touched Delaney's face before the sky above her had time to turn from black to gray. She opened her eyes. Her hands were so numb that it took a while before she could bend them again. She tucked them between her knees and held them there until feeling returned little by little, 1 finger at a time, bringing with it that familiar prickling pain she had learned to regard as a morning greeting. The sheet of cardboard beneath her back was damp. She sat up, folded it into quarters, and hid it behind the drain pipe, in the same place as yesterday, in the same place as the day before. Everything had to be in its proper place. That was the first thing she had learned when she no longer had a door she could lock. If everything had a place of its own, then so did she. Delaney rose, brushed the wet dust from the hem of her hoodie, and stepped into the small yard behind the bakery. The ground floor windowsill came up to her chest. Its wooden ledge rotted away at one corner, and there, as on every morning, lay a loaf of bread beneath a cloth. She stood looking at it for several seconds before touching it. She always did that, because on some mornings, she was afraid it wouldn't be there anymore, and that fear needed a moment of silence in which to pass. She lifted the cloth. The loaf was still warm beneath her palm, holding the soft, moist warmth of something that hadn't been out of the oven for long, and that heat flowed straight into her numb fingers like a medicine no prescription could provide. She broke the loaf in half. She ate 1 half right there, standing up, slowly, taking small bites, because if she ate too quickly, she would be hungry again sooner. She wrapped the other half in a paper napkin she had already used twice, folded it into a neat square, and slipped it into the front pocket of her hoodie. She didn't think about the afternoon. She simply saved it, out of a habit that lived in her body, the way people locked a door without remembering they had done it. Then she folded the bakery's cloth, smoothed all 4 corners, and placed it exactly where it had been on the windowsill. There were rules she had made for herself and held to more fiercely than any law. Don't ask anyone for anything. Never be the first to hold out a hand. If someone gave her something, she accepted it, and she returned the cloth neatly folded. Don't look directly into anyone's eyes for more than a moment, because a gaze was something that forced people to make a decision about her, and she didn't want to make anyone decide. Don't sleep in the same place 2 nights in a row if someone else knew about it. Don't tell her story. And the final rule, the one she needed most, was to count. When she walked, she counted her steps. From the street corner with the yellow fire hydrant to the first lamppost was 41 steps. From that lamppost to the bakery's back door was 93. From the place where she slept to the edge of the market, if she kept close to the wall, was 227. She knew those numbers so precisely that she could have walked the route with her eyes closed. It wasn't because she needed to know the way. It was because when her mind was occupied with counting, it didn't have time to do anything else. It didn't have time to remember the sound of a washing machine turning in a small apartment on Ashland Street. It didn't have time to remember a tiny hand wrapped around her index finger, refusing to let go through one long night. It didn't have time to remember the smell of smoke on the coat hanging behind the door, the one she hadn't dared wash for weeks, only so she could hold on to that scent a little longer. Counting was how she traveled from one place to another without having to pass through those places. 1, 2, 3, 41, 93. And by the time she arrived, the sky was already light, and breathing was always easier during the day than it was at night. The bakery door opened with the sound of a small brass bell, 2 notes, a sound she knew by heart as intimately as the rhythm of her own breathing. The old woman with white hair stepped onto the stoop with a broom in her hand, stopped when she saw Delaney, and nodded. That was all. A single nod. It wasn't the kind of nod people gave to something pitiful, nor was it the sort of greeting offered merely out of obligation. It was the nod one gave to someone familiar passing through the alley beside one's home. "Good morning, bright-eyed girl," she said. Delaney inclined her head slightly. The old woman had called her that from the first moment she saw her, and had never once asked her name. Delaney had never asked for hers either. There was a certain kindness in not asking, a kindness both women understood without needing to speak of it. Some people carried their names the way they carried a wound, and asking them to say those names aloud meant asking them to open it. The old woman swept the stoop several times, slowly, then leaned the broom against the wall and went back inside. A little while later, she came out again wearing an ash-gray cardigan, a mesh shopping bag hanging from one hand, its handles worn thin with age. She paused at the edge of the sidewalk, looked up at the sky for a while, as though weighing something in her mind, then pulled her collar higher. Rain was coming. Delaney watched the woman's small, bent figure disappear toward the market, where the blue awnings were already beginning to unfold, and the voices of vendors were starting to carry through the morning air. She pulled the hood over her head, felt the warmth of the half-loaf still resting in her pocket, and thought that today would be exactly like every other day. Tobias Wren stood beneath the awning of the drugstore at the corner of the market, holding the door with one hand and pointing with the other toward the wooden bench set against the wall. "Wait here where you'll stay dry," he said. "I'll get your medicine and come right back." Mrs. Rosa nodded, both hands clasped around the mesh bag in front of her stomach, and he believed that nod. He always had. For the past several years, every Saturday morning had been the same. She went to the market, and he followed 3 steps behind, never any closer, because she wouldn't allow anyone to walk beside her. She said that if someone walked beside her, it made her look as though she could no longer manage on her own. Inside the drugstore, the young woman behind the counter had to search for a new box of medicine in the storeroom at the back. Tobias stood looking outside through the glass clouded with condensation. He saw Mrs. Rosa's ash-gray cardigan among the market awnings, saw the sky darken with startling speed, saw the first drop of rain strike the window and break into a long streak that ran down the glass. The young woman returned and asked if he needed a bag. He said he didn't. He paid. He slipped the box of medicine into the inside pocket of his coat. That was all. That was all it took. When he pushed open the door and stepped outside, the rain was already falling heavily, and the wooden bench against the wall was empty. All that remained was a puddle spreading across the wood in the exact place where she had been sitting, and in that puddle, he saw his own reflection. He stood motionless for the length of a single breath. Then he ran. He ran back toward the head of the market, calling her name, weaving beneath awnings that snapped violently in the wind, striking one of the support poles, and sending the water gathered overhead, cascading onto his shoulders. He asked the flower seller. She shook her head. He asked the fish seller. The man pointed west, then pointed east, then shrugged. Tobias kept running, and each time he called her name, his voice broke a little more, until it no longer sounded like someone calling out, but like someone begging forgiveness. At that same moment, several miles from the market and far above the water, August Koval stood with his back to the room, looking down at the harbor dissolving into the rain. The orange crane stood motionless like a flock of sleeping herons. Behind him, a man named Wendell Pryor was speaking. He had been speaking for some time. His voice had begun with denial, then shifted into explanation, and finally descended into the voice of a man who had nothing left to hold on to. He had stolen the dock workers' wages. He had been taking the money since the previous summer, a little from every pay period, partly because he believed he could put it back, and partly because the lenders from the salvage yard district had already appeared outside his home twice. He spoke of the nights he had spent sitting in the bar, of the certainty he had felt that the next hand would be different. August didn't interrupt him. He let the man speak until there was nothing more to say, until every word had been drained from him, and no one in that room dared to move, because the silence of the man standing by the window carried more weight than any shout. When Wendell finally stopped, August turned around. He didn't come any closer. He merely asked for the lenders' names, listened to the answer, then gave a single nod to Bear, who stood at the far end of the room. "Pay them everything today," he said, "including the interest. Tell them the payment came from me." Wendell looked up, and for one brief moment, something very much like hope flickered in his eyes. August looked directly at it. "Don't thank me," he said. "You won't be here to thank me." He fastened the button of his suit jacket, slowly, like a man preparing to step out into the cold. "The money you took was someone else's dinner on the table. It was someone's rent for that month. I understand why you did it. I still won't forgive you." He turned away. "Get him out of the city before dark. And if I see him on this side of the river again, we'll have to discuss the matter one more time. I don't like repeating old conversations." Wendell was escorted out. No one touched him. No one needed to touch him. The door closed. The room returned to the sound of rain tapping against the glass. August remained there for a while longer, and on his wrist, beneath the cuff of his shirt, rested a watch with a scratched face. The old watch no one in that building dared to ask about, because no one understood why a man like him would wear something so inexpensive. Then the phone on the table vibrated, the screen lit up, and a single word appeared upon it. "Mother." He reached for it. The screen went dark. Delaney heard the laughter first. It was the kind of laughter she had learned to recognize long ago. Not the laughter of someone who was happy, but the laughter of someone who had an audience, a sound that was loud and thin at once, rising sharply and breaking apart, then rising again. She was sitting with her knees drawn up behind the garbage cans, the hood of her sweatshirt pulled low over her head, the untouched half-loaf still in her pocket. She intended not to move. That was the rule. Other people's troubles weren't hers, and anyone who lived on the street understood that stepping into someone else's trouble was the quickest way to lose what little they still had. Then she heard the old woman's voice. "Can someone tell me where my home is?" Her voice was quiet and trembling, and she repeated herself. "Where is my home? I can't remember the way back." There was more laughter, and a young man's voice told her to ask again, only louder this time. Delaney stood up. She didn't think about what she was doing. Her feet had already carried her out of the narrow space between the wall and the garbage cans before her mind could offer a single reason, and when she rounded the corner, she saw everything at once. 2 boys stood in a semicircle, 2 phones held up in the air, and in the middle of them was the ash-gray cardigan. The mesh bag had been snatched away and lay on its side on the ground, with several tomatoes rolling through a puddle. The old woman was trying to pick them up, and every time she bent down, one of the 2 boys nudged a tomato a little farther away with the toe of his shoe, and they all laughed again. Delaney walked forward and stood between them. She didn't raise her hands. She didn't raise her voice. She spoke softly, almost pleading. "She can't remember the way home. Let her go." The tallest boy lowered his phone and looked her over, from her torn shoes to the hood covering her head. Then he laughed, and that laugh revealed everything he thought of her. Then he shoved her. It wasn't a blow, only the flat of his palm pressing into the center of her chest, the way someone might push open a door. But she was light, and the bricks beneath her were wet, and she fell backward onto the ground, both palms striking the pavement as cold water soaked through the thin fabric over her knees. She sat there for a moment, then she braced her hands against the ground, rose, and stepped back into the exact place where she had been standing. She placed herself once more in the empty space between the 2 boys and the old woman. A brief silence followed, the silence of people who had just realized that things weren't unfolding the way they had expected. Then the tallest boy stepped forward, and this time, it was much harder. The world tilted. That was the only way she would ever be able to describe it afterward. It wasn't the force of an impact, but the earth itself suddenly rising on one side while the ceiling of the sky dropped on the other. And in that moment, her ears filled with a dense ringing, while every sound around her became distant and distorted, as though someone were speaking to her from beneath the water, through something thick and cold. She lay on her side on the wet pavement. There was the taste of copper in her mouth, and the taste of rain, and the 2 mingled together. She closed her eyes, only for a second. She thought about remaining still. The thought came quickly, and with perfect clarity, carrying no shame at all. It was simply a way out opening directly before her, and some part of her had already begun walking toward it. Then she opened her eyes. About 3 steps from where she lay was the mesh bag, and beyond that bag, the ash-gray cardigan was still there, pressed tightly against the red brick wall. The old woman was still there. Delaney rolled over, pushed herself up onto her elbows, and began to crawl. She crawled across the wet bricks, slowly, inch by inch, her face close to the ground. And as she pulled one arm forward to grip a crack between the bricks, she felt something slip away. It was very slight, so slight that on an ordinary day, she wouldn't have noticed. The hospital wristband slid from her thin wrist, fell to the ground, and was immediately caught by the rainwater streaming along the gutter beside the road. She saw it. It drifted away, turning once, its pink plastic face tilting toward the sky for a moment, long enough for her to see the faded words upon it. She knew exactly what those words said. She had read them every day since that winter. The wristband drifted a little farther, touched the mouth of the drain, and began to turn more slowly. She could reach it. If she pushed herself upright and took 2 steps to the right, she could reach it. 2 steps to the right meant 2 steps away from where she needed to be. Delaney turned her face away. She dragged herself a little farther forward, into the exact space between the 2 boys and the red brick wall. Then she planted both hands against the pavement, spread her arms as wide as she could, and remained there. The 3rd time, she couldn't get up again. She tried. She gathered everything she had left and forced it into her arms, managing to lift her shoulders about a handspan from the bricks before her left elbow gave way and she collapsed, her cheek pressed against the cold ground. Something inside her chest cried out when she breathed in, a short, sharp sound, and she knew at once what it was. Her old profession was still somewhere inside her, automatically giving everything a name whether she wanted it to or not. A rib. Not broken, only fractured. People could still breathe with fractured ribs. It was simply that every breath would demand a price. She lay on her side with her eyes open and saw the old woman's worn black shoes about an arm's length from her face. The woman was huddled against the red brick wall, her hands clasped together in front of her chest, and she was trembling. It wasn't from the cold. Delaney had seen that trembling many times during her night shifts, in people who had just been brought into the emergency room and didn't understand what was happening to them. A trembling that began in the chin, spread into the shoulders, then traveled all the way down to the knees, the trembling of a body being overtaken by fear. Delaney rolled over. She couldn't stand anymore, so she did the only thing she could still do. She rolled toward the wall and dragged herself forward until her back was pressed against the old woman's shins, until her body lay across the space between the woman and everything on the other side. She curled herself inward, drawing up her knees, wrapping one arm behind her around the old woman's ankle, and she remained still. That was all she had left. Not strength, not courage. Only a body placed in exactly the right spot and refusing to leave. Then she raised her face, and she spoke. Her voice was quiet, hoarse, and broken, because every word had to pass through the place in her chest that hurt. But it was calm. It was strangely calm, and even she was surprised to hear it, because it was the voice she had used for years in brightly lit rooms at 3 o'clock in the morning, the voice she used when she held a stranger's hand and told them they were going to be all right. "Ma'am," she said. "Ma'am, listen to me. Breathe with me. In through your nose. Slowly. That's right." The old woman gave a small sob. "Don't look at them," Delaney continued. "Look at me. Just look at me. Breathe in, then breathe out through your mouth. You're doing it. One more time." And the old woman followed her. Her hands were still trembling, but her chest began to move in a rhythm, a slow rhythm, and the trembling in her chin eased a little. Delaney kept her eyes locked on the woman's. She didn't know what was happening behind her. She simply held that gaze, counted the breaths, and kept speaking. Then she realized something. She realized that there was no more laughter. On a Saturday morning, Fells Point Market was always a dense wall of sound, the vendors calling out, the awnings snapping in the wind, the carts grinding over the bricks, the voices of people bargaining, and all of it had been there only moments ago, but now it wasn't. Silence spread outward from where she lay like water spilling across a tabletop. The fish seller at the first stall set his knife down on the cutting board. He didn't wipe his hands. He merely set the knife down and straightened. 2 women selling flowers stepped out from behind their stall, walked all the way into the middle of the aisle, and stood there. An old man choosing potatoes placed the one in his hand back into the basket. No one said a word. No one stepped forward, but every face turned in the same direction, and that silence carried more weight than any shout could have. Then, at the head of the market, where the entrance opened toward the harbor, a man with broad shoulders approached and stopped. He simply stood there, his hands hanging at his sides, rainwater streaming from the brim of his hat. He didn't call out. He didn't raise a hand. He stood there, and he watched. Delaney heard running footsteps. 3 pairs of shoes struck the wet bricks, growing more distant as they turned into the alley beside the bakery, then disappeared entirely. She let her face fall against the bricks. She breathed. Then she felt someone touch her. The old woman had crawled toward her. She came forward on her knees, her ash-gray cardigan soaked through, and reached out with both trembling hands, placing them on either side of Delaney's face, holding it as someone might hold something that was about to slip away. Those hands were cold, and the skin was so thin that Delaney could feel every joint of bone beneath it. The old woman held Delaney's face in her palms for a long while, then released one hand and began stroking her hair. She brushed it slowly and steadily from Delaney's temple toward the back of her head, with the gesture that women who became mothers long ago carry forever in their hands, even after they have forgotten almost everything else. Delaney's hair was soaked with rain and clung to her cheek. The old woman swept it aside, then stroked it again, then swept it away once more. Delaney lay still beneath that hand. No one had touched her like that in a very long time. So long that her body no longer knew how to respond, and the only thing it could do was tremble once, very faintly, from somewhere deep inside her chest. She opened her mouth. It took 2 breaths before she could force the sound from her throat. "Ma'am," she said. "Are you all right?" The hand in her hair stopped. The old woman looked down at her, and for a moment, her face went completely blank, as though the question had been spoken in a language she had never heard. Then her mouth twisted. She began to cry. It wasn't the heaving sob of someone who had just survived a moment of terror. It was the kind of crying that burst from somewhere far deeper, from a place that had been sealed shut for much too long. Tears streamed down both of her wrinkled cheeks and mingled with the rain, and she didn't wipe them away. "My child," she said, her voice breaking into pieces. "In all my life, no one has ever asked me that before asking about themselves." She bent lower until her forehead almost touched Delaney's. "Not one person." Delaney closed her eyes. She couldn't say anything. Then the old woman raised her head, and something inside her changed. She looked around the market, at the awnings and the puddles, and her expression shifted into a childlike confusion. "Where is my bag?" she asked. "I have to buy vegetables. I remember that I have to buy vegetables." She released Delaney and braced a hand against the ground as though trying to stand, but then she sank back down, her shoulders collapsing. "Where is my home?" Delaney slowly lifted her hand, found the woman's wrist, and held it. "Just sit here with me for a while," she said. "It's raining. Wherever you go now, you'll only get wet." The old woman sat still. Water dripped from the strands of white hair onto the collar of her cardigan. She looked down at the hand holding her wrist, at those scraped fingers and broken nails, then placed her other hand over it, enclosing Delaney's hand between both of hers. And she became lucid again. Delaney recognized the exact moment it happened because the old woman's eyes changed. The haze within them dissolved, and she looked at Delaney like someone who was truly seeing her. "Listen to me," the old woman said, and her voice was clear and steady now, no longer trembling. "My son will be here soon." She tightened her hold on Delaney's hand. "Don't be afraid of him. He looks frightening. Everyone is afraid when they see him. People say many things about him, and I don't argue because I don't know everything." She paused, and her eyes filled with tears again. "But he is my son. I held him in that bakery. I have known him since before he knew how to hold a spoon." She bent even closer. "Don't be afraid of him, my child. Do you hear me?" Delaney gave the smallest nod. She didn't have the strength to ask who the woman's son was. She didn't have the strength to consider what those words meant. She simply lay there on the wet bricks, her hand held tightly by an old woman whose name she didn't even know, and let the rain fall upon her face. Then the old woman lifted her head. Delaney heard it too. From the head of the market, where the entrance opened toward the harbor, came the sound of wheels rolling slowly over the wet bricks. Not quickly, not urgently, only the sound of wheels turning very slowly and steadily, drawing closer with every passing moment. 3 black vehicles stopped one behind another at the head of the market, and none of them turned off its engine immediately. They remained there for a while beneath the rain, their windows dark, water streaming in ribbons of light across their hoods. Then the doors opened almost in unison. Men stepped out. They wore dark coats, and they didn't run. They walked into the center of the market, slowly and steadily, their hands lowered, their faces revealing nothing, and it was that very slowness that made the vendors move aside without anyone needing to tell them. The fish seller stepped back half a pace. The two flower sellers took hold of each other's hands. The broad-shouldered man standing at the entrance from the harbor turned around, and when he moved aside to clear the way, Delaney understood that he wasn't the one in command. The leader came last. He was taller than all the others, and he didn't look at anyone. He walked directly toward the red brick wall, and when he was only a few steps away, he stopped, and Delaney saw something very strange. He stood motionless for the length of one breath, like a man who had to give himself permission to continue. Then he went to the old woman. He crouched beside her, and he spoke. Delaney couldn't hear what he said. She was less than an arm's length away, yet she still couldn't hear him, because his voice was so soft that it traveled only from his mouth to the old woman's ear, and not 1 inch farther. Delaney saw only his hand rise very slowly and touch the woman's shoulder, then slide down to support her arm. He turned the woman's hand over in his own and examined it with a care that didn't seem to belong to a man built like him. The old woman said something. He nodded. She said something more, and this time, she turned her head toward Delaney. The man looked up. He looked down at her. Then he did the thing that, for many years afterward, the people who had been at Fells Point Market that morning would continue telling one another about. He stepped closer and lowered himself onto one knee, right in the middle of a puddle of filthy water. The leg of his black suit sank into water mixed with mud and crushed scraps of vegetables, soaking through and darkening the fabric, and he didn't look down at it even once. Behind him, the men in dark coats froze. Not one of them moved. One man opened his mouth as though he meant to speak, then stopped himself. Because they had followed this man through rooms and dockyards and mornings no one wanted to remember, and not once in all those years, had they ever seen him lower himself beneath the person before him. He leaned closer to her. "Can you hear me?" Delaney opened her eyes. The face above her blurred, then sharpened again. She saw a long scar running along the left side of his jaw, saw blue-gray eyes, and saw rainwater streaming from his hair and dripping onto the collar of his white shirt. She tried to open her mouth. The first thing that emerged from her throat wasn't a cry of pain. "Her wrist," she said. Her voice was so faint that he had to bend even lower. "Check her wrist." She caught herself with that hand when she fell. "Don't let her stand up by herself." The man went still. She saw it clearly, that sudden stillness, one fleeting moment in those blue-gray eyes, as though something had just shifted from a place where it had rested undisturbed for a very long time. "Who are you?" he asked. Delaney breathed out. Inside her chest, the place that hurt flared brightly and then dimmed, while the edges of the world began darkening inward. "No one," she said. Then she remembered. She tried to lift her hand, raising it only a few inches, and her trembling finger pointed toward the gutter beside the road. "Down there," she said. "There is a wristband. Plastic. Pink." She was speaking to him, or perhaps to anyone who could still hear her. She no longer knew. "Please, someone." Then the world went dark. The man said nothing. He raised his head and gestured toward the gutter with 2 fingers. In the ground-floor study of the Koval mansion, Tobias Wren stood straight before the desk, and he didn't speak until August closed the door behind him. Then he reached into his coat pocket, took out the car keys, and placed them on the wooden surface. Next came his work phone. He set it neatly beside the keys with the screen facing down, then stepped back half a pace and stood at attention, his arms hanging at his sides. "I am resigning, sir," he said. August didn't look down at the desk. He walked around it and pulled out the chair, but he didn't sit. "Tell me what happened," he said. And Tobias told him. He spoke in the even voice of a man who had rehearsed the story in his mind too many times. He explained that the old woman had refused to let anyone walk beside her, that he had always followed 3 steps behind, that the sky had begun to threaten rain, and that he had thought the medicine needed to be collected that day rather than left until Monday. He told him about the wooden bench against the wall, about pointing to it and watching her nod. He told him about the young woman behind the counter having to search the storeroom for the medicine, about the glass clouded with condensation, about how he could still see the ash-gray cardigan among the market awnings while he waited. Then he told him about the puddle on the bench. That was when his voice finally broke, and he had to stop, clenching both hands behind his back until his knuckles turned white. "It was only a few minutes, sir," he said. "I counted it again. Exactly as long as it takes to boil a kettle of water. August remained silent. He was silent for so long that the rain outside the window became the only sound in the room, and Tobias continued standing exactly as he was, motionless, waiting for what he believed would certainly come. Then August picked up the keys. He didn't throw them. He merely held them out at the level of Tobias's chest and kept them there. "Take them back." Tobias didn't move. "Sir, you are staying," August said. He placed the keys in Tobias's hand and pressed the man's fingers closed around them. "If I dismiss you, someone else will walk 3 steps behind my mother tomorrow morning. That person will do everything correctly. That person won't be afraid." He released Tobias's hand. "But I need someone who knows how to be afraid." He turned away and walked toward the window. "You will never enter another drugstore without a second person waiting outside. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir." "Then go wash your face. You look as though you have just drowned." At that same moment, in the kitchen at the back of the house, a white cloth had been spread across the long stone table, and Delaney had been laid upon it. Dr. Ophelia Vance had removed her coat and rolled her sleeves to her elbows, and she worked in silence for a long while, her aged hands moving over every part of that body with the practiced skill of someone who had once stitched soldiers together in places where there were no hospitals. When August entered, she didn't look up immediately. She pulled the covering back into place, wiped her hands on a towel, and only then turned toward him. 2 fractured ribs, 1 broken finger on her left hand. There is an old injury in her left leg that was never properly treated, and now it is swollen again, she said, her voice growing lower with every word. "But that isn't what concerns me." She pointed to Delaney's wrist, then to the collarbone rising sharply beneath her skin. "Mr. Koval, this body hasn't been without food for 1 week or 1 month. Her blood is thin. There are Beau's lines across her fingernails, the kind of horizontal ridges found only in someone who has been severely malnourished for a long time. There are calluses on her palms that people develop only after sleeping on hard ground for many nights in a row." She set down the towel. "I have examined people who have been beaten. This one is different." She looked directly at him. "This woman wasn't merely beaten this morning. The world has been beating her for a very long time." August said nothing. He stood there while, beyond the walls, the rain continued pouring onto the awning. The pink plastic wristband had been washed clean by someone and placed on a piece of white gauze at the corner of the stone table, and Ophelia Vance had been looking at it all this time without picking it up. Now she did. She turned it beneath the light, and her eyes narrowed. "They searched all her pockets," she said. "No wallet, no identification, no phone, not 1 scrap of paper with a name on it. Nothing at all, Mr. Koval. By every method this city uses to count its people, the woman lying on my table doesn't exist." She held out the wristband. "Except for this." August took it. It was so light that it seemed almost weightless in his hand. The plastic had yellowed and softened from being rubbed for so many years, but the printed words could still be read if he tilted it toward the light. He read the baby's name first. Then he read the birth weight, a number so small that he had to read it again before he could believe it. Beneath that, in smaller print, were the patient number, the name of the hospital, and the mother's name. "A newborn's wristband always carries the mother's name," Ophelia said softly. "So no one gives the baby to the wrong person." She pulled the thin blanket over Delaney. "She has worn that around her wrist since that winter. The skin beneath it is thinner than the skin around it. That means she never took it off." Ophelia looked down. "Do you understand what I am telling you? The only thing in this world proving that this woman still exists is the wristband belonging to the child she lost." August didn't answer. He placed the wristband back on the gauze and left the kitchen. Bear was waiting for him in the study with a thin file, the edges of its pages still damp from the rain. "That was fast," August said. "Once you have a name, you have everything, sir," Bear replied. "The hard part is when there is no name." August sat down, opened the file, and began turning the pages. The first page was a man's death certificate. His occupation was listed as firefighter. The cause of death was a warehouse fire in the Eastern District, the one the whole city had talked about for several days and then forgotten. A wife's name appeared on the line for next of kin. August turned the page. The second page was also a death certificate. This time, it belonged to a little girl who hadn't yet lived through 2 winters. He read the cause of death, the long name of an illness he didn't understand, then read the date. He calculated the time between the 2 documents in his head, and he stopped for a moment. The third page was an administrative ruling from the state health board. Nursing license revoked. The reason was stated briefly: a serious medication error resulting in complications for a patient. No statement of explanation had been attached. The fourth page was a printout of a local newspaper article. The headline sprawled across the top, written by someone who had chosen every word to make it hurt as much as possible, and beneath it was a photograph taken secretly from a distance, showing a woman leaving through the hospital's back door with her hood pulled low over her head. Bear stood motionless. "After that article, the trail ends, sir," he said. "She never rented another home, never opened another account, never registered a vehicle, no address. She disappeared from every list." He gave the faintest shrug. "People without homes are the hardest people to find in America, sir, because there isn't a system anywhere that records them." August turned back to the first page. His gaze moved down to the line containing the full name. He read it. Then he read it again. Silence settled over the room, and Bear knew at once that something had happened, because August's hand, the hand that always rested motionless on the desk like an object rather than a living part of his body, had just closed into a fist. He read the name once more. Then he stood. He rose very slowly, more slowly than Bear had ever seen him move, and raised his hands to fasten the buttons of his suit jacket, one at a time. "Bear." "Yes, sir." "Which room is she in?" The second-floor hallway was long and dark, lit only by a few wall lamps set to their nighttime glow, and each time August passed beneath one, the light swept across his face before returning him to the darkness. He walked slowly. He had crossed this hallway thousands of times, yet it had never seemed as long as it did tonight, that name. He had carried it in his mind since that winter, carried it the way a man carries a fragment of metal lodged in his flesh after an explosion, aching quietly, hidden from sight, impossible to remove. It had begun on a January night, when someone called him at 2 o'clock in the morning and told him that his younger brother was lying in the emergency room at St. Bartholomew's Hospital. The boy had been brought in under a name that wasn't his own, because in the world where the Koval brothers lived, that was necessary. A man didn't carry a family name like theirs into a public emergency room after something had happened at the docks. August was 2 flights away. He had stood in a foreign airport for 4 hours with a phone pressed to his ear, listening to each brief update as it came, and by the time he landed in Baltimore, everything was over. The record stated that during the night shift, a nurse had stopped a medication prescribed by the attending physician without authorization. The record stated that the patient's condition had subsequently deteriorated. The records continued with a long line of words August had needed someone else to explain, and behind all those words lay only one truth. His younger brother was never going to make it. The hospital apologized. The hospital reached a settlement. The nurse's license was revoked, the file was closed, and everyone was satisfied, because there was a name to place inside the empty space. August had that name too. He had ordered his people to find her during the very first week. Then he encountered something he had never encountered in his entire life. He couldn't find her. That name wasn't attached to any rented home. It opened no accounts. It registered no vehicles, filed no documents, and appeared on none of the lists money could buy. He was a man who could locate a shipping container in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean with 3 phone calls, yet he couldn't find one woman in his own city. On some nights, he thought she had fled the country. On others, he thought someone was hiding her. Not once during all those nights, had he considered the possibility that she was sleeping behind a garbage can only a few hundred steps from his mother's home. August stopped before the last door in the hallway. It was slightly ajar. Light from the night lamp inside cast a pale yellow streak across the wooden floor. He raised his hand to the doorknob and stood there for a while, and no one saw him in that moment. Then he pushed the door open a little farther. She was asleep. She lay facing the wall, her body curled inward, her knees drawn close to her chest. One arm was bent around her head, her hand pressed over her ear and covering half her face. Even in sleep, even on a clean bed beneath a roof with 4 men guarding the door, her body had instinctively taken the position of someone too accustomed to sleeping in places where anyone passing by could touch her. It was the posture of someone protecting her head. August stood in the doorway and looked at that posture, and something inside him shifted in a direction he hadn't permitted. He had entered rooms far more difficult than this one. He had sat across from men who deserved punishment far more than she did, and his hands had never trembled. But he stood there at the threshold, and he didn't enter. He gently pulled the door closed until the latch settled into place without making a sound. Then he walked back along the hallway. Bear was waiting at the top of the stairs. "Sir?" August didn't stop. "Find Dr. Halloran," he said. "The man who signed the records that night. Find out where he is, what he is doing, and who he works for." He placed one hand on the stair railing. "Find him quickly, Bear, before I do something I can't take back." The first thing Delaney noticed when she opened her eyes was that the ceiling was too high. She lay still and stared at it for a long while, trying and failing to fit it into some place in her memory. The ceiling was high and cream-colored, with molding running around its edges, and in the center was an unlit lamp shaped like a flower. There were no pipes running across it, no spreading water stains, no sound of traffic rising from the street below. Then she felt the sheet beneath her back. It was dry. It was soft. It carried the scent of clean fabric dried beneath the sun, a scent she hadn't encountered in so long that her body recognized it before her mind did, and that was what frightened her. She lifted the blanket. She looked down at her hands resting upon the white fabric, at the broken nails, the scratches, the finger secured in a splint, then turned onto one side to see whether she had left any dirt where she had been lying. She checked the shoulder of her clothes. She checked the elbows. She ran one hand down to the edge of the sheet near her feet to see whether it had been pulled out of place. Someone had changed her clothes and dressed her in a clean set of soft gray garments, and she pulled up the sleeve to examine her wrist as well. There wasn't a trace of mud anywhere, yet she remained on her side for a long time, her body curled toward the edge, trying to occupy as little of that bed as possible. Then she turned her head. A piece of white cloth had been spread smoothly across the small table beside the bed, and in the exact center of that cloth, placed neatly with its plastic face turned upward, was the hospital wristband. It had been washed clean. There was no longer any mud in the clasp. No gray stain along the edge that she had spent months trying to scrape away with her fingernail. Someone had washed it, dried it, spread out a piece of white cloth, and placed it on top. Delaney reached toward it. Her fingertip touched the plastic and remained there. Then she began to cry. It came suddenly, without warning, and it was unlike anything she could still remember. She hadn't cried when they read the decision revoking her license. She hadn't cried when they came to seize the apartment on Ashland Street, and she stood on the steps holding a cardboard box. She hadn't cried during any of the nights she spent on cardboard behind the bakery. She had believed that part of her had stopped working entirely, but someone had waded into a filthy gutter in the rain to retrieve a piece of pink plastic that wasn't worth a cent, then washed it and placed it on white cloth as though it were something precious. And that part of her broke open. She cried without making a sound, her shoulders trembling, one hand covering her mouth because even now she was afraid of disturbing someone. There was the faint sound of a chair shifting. Delaney flinched and turned. The old woman with white hair was sitting in the chair beside the bed, a stack of handkerchiefs resting on her lap, and she was folding them one at a time. She didn't look at Delaney. She simply continued folding, smoothing each one flat, then placing it on the stack beside her, as though nothing unusual were happening in the room, as though a woman crying in bed were as natural as rain falling beyond the window. She left Delaney undisturbed until her breathing became steady again. Then she set down the handkerchief she had only partly folded. "Have some bread, my child," she said. Delaney wiped her face with the back of her hand. "Yes, I told him to bake it already. The kind with poppy seeds on top. You like that kind." The old woman continued speaking as naturally as if the two of them had been eating breakfast together for years. "Only eat a little at first. When someone has been hungry for a long time, the stomach can't bear too much food all at once. I know about that." Delaney looked at her. "Ma'am," she said, "how is your wrist?" The old woman raised her arm to show the fabric brace wrapped around her wrist, then smiled, a wrinkled and very gentle smile. "They have wrapped it for me. I am still strong," she said. "You lie down and rest." Delaney nodded, and as she turned back, her eyes passed over the second chair in the corner of the room. A black suit lay neatly folded upon it, the trouser cuffs still dark with dampness. She didn't ask who it belonged to. She didn't need to. He came the following afternoon, while the old woman was downstairs taking her nap. Delaney heard 2 knocks at the door. Then it opened, and the man stepped inside. He pulled the chair from the corner, placed it some distance from the bed, neither too close nor too far away, then sat down. He didn't speak for a while. He simply sat there with both hands resting on his knees, and Delaney noticed an old watch beneath the cuff of his shirt, its crystal covered in scratches, its leather strap worn smooth around the buckle hole. It didn't match anything else he was wearing. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Better, sir. Dr. Vance says you are lying about that." Delaney looked down at her hands. "She is right." Another silence followed. Then he spoke, his voice still as quiet as before, neither faster nor slower. "I want to ask you something. You don't have to answer if you don't want to." He looked up. "Why did you do it?" Delaney didn't answer immediately. "You didn't know who she was," he continued. "You owed her nothing. There were 3 of them, and they were bigger than you. You could have remained behind that garbage can, and no one in this world could have blamed you for it." He paused. "But you came out." She turned her face toward the window. The rain had stopped outside, and the late afternoon sunlight lay in a pale golden streak across the sill. "I had a daughter," she said. He said nothing. She wasn't even 2 years old. Her voice was even and slow, like someone crossing a slippery place and having to set down each foot with care. Her name was Poppy. She loved the sound of the washing machine. The old machine in the apartment on Ashland Street was very loud, and everyone complained about it, but she slept more peacefully when she heard that sound. "I used to carry her to the bathroom doorway and sit there with her until the machine finished its cycle," she continued. She held my finger very tightly. All babies do that, but she held on longer. Some nights, I had to sit still for an entire hour because I couldn't pull my hand away without waking her. She paused for a moment. Then one morning in April, she went to sleep and didn't wake again. August remained motionless. "The night before," Delaney said, "I took her to the hospital. The very hospital where I worked. I knew every hallway in that building. I knew the name of the man who guarded the elevator, and I knew which coffee machine had a broken button." She raised a hand and touched her wrist, where the wristband now rested. "I knelt in the middle of the main corridor. I was wearing my medical coat, sir. I was still wearing the coat with my name embroidered over my chest, and I knelt there and begged. I begged every person who passed. Some of them were people whose faces I knew. Some had worked the same shifts as I had." Her voice never rose. "They walked around me. It wasn't because they were cruel. They were simply busy, and each of them believed someone else would stop. Everyone thought the same thing, and because everyone thought that way, no one did." She turned back to look at him. "No one stepped forward when it was me," she said. "So I made myself a promise. If I remained alive, and if I ever saw someone fall while no one around them moved, then I would be the one to step forward, even if I managed it only once." She gave the smallest shrug. "That Saturday morning, I heard the old woman asking where her home was. That was all, sir." August sat for a long time without speaking. Then he asked, "When you leave here, where do you intend to go?" Delaney gave a quiet laugh, and there was nothing joyful in it. "I have never had anywhere to plan on going, sir." He stood. He returned the chair neatly to the corner, then stopped in the middle of the room. "Then stay." She looked up. "My mother needs someone to look after her," he said. "I bought her estates across the city, but she refuses to leave that old bakery where my father and brother were raised. She insists on baking every morning, even as her mind fades. I hired bakers to run the shop and keep her safe, but she still won't let a stranger close to her. She will accept you. You know how to speak to someone who is frightened. I heard you doing it at the market." He walked toward the door. "You need a bed. I need someone who knows what she is doing." He placed his hand on the doorknob. "This is a job, Miss Whitcomb. It isn't charity. If it were charity, I would have sent you to the bus station with an envelope of money." They repaired the bakery for the old woman over the weekend, and from then on, she made Delaney accompany her every morning. She wouldn't allow anyone to drive her. So the 2 women walked, Delaney using a cane on her left side, Tobias following 3 steps behind, and this time, another man remained outside whenever they entered any store. On the 4th or perhaps the 5th morning, while the old woman stood kneading dough and Delaney sat on the high stool in the corner of the kitchen, the woman suddenly stopped moving her hands. "Do you know that window over there?" she asked. Delaney looked toward it. It was the window in the back wall, the one with a wooden sill rotted at one corner, and beyond it was the narrow space between the wall and the garbage cans. "Yes," Delaney said. The old woman began kneading again, her eyes never leaving the dough. 211, she said. Delaney didn't understand. 211 mornings, my child. The old woman still didn't look up. "I placed bread there for 211 mornings. Somewhere in the kitchen, The oven made a small clicking sound. You still thought it was bread left over from the day before, didn't you? The old woman said. I knew you thought that. I wanted you to think it. If I had told you the truth, you wouldn't have taken it anymore. I know people like you. I have lived a long time. Then she looked up, and her eyes were perfectly clear, with that lucidity Delaney had seen only a few times. I sell the leftover bread at a lower price in the afternoon, but for the loaf on the windowsill, I needed an extra batch of dough every morning. I placed it there before opening the bakery, so no one would see and start saying things to you. She wiped her hands on her apron. I forget many things, my child. I forget the way home. Some days, I even forget my husband's name, but I don't forget to count. Delaney sat motionless on the high stool, and she felt something sink inside her chest. 211 mornings. Through all those mornings, while she believed she was someone no one could see, someone surviving on what the rest of the world threw away, an old woman losing her memory had risen before opening time to need an extra batch of dough for her alone, and had counted every single day. Delaney had believed that Saturday morning was the day she saved the old woman. It turned out that she herself had been saved long before then, once every day, quietly, by the very person she had lain upon the bricks to protect. Delaney opened her mouth to say something, but no words came. The old woman didn't wait for them. She merely pushed a lump of dough toward her. Knead it, my child. If you sit still too long, your back will grow stiff. Then the bakery door opened with the 2 notes of the brass bell, and 3 children from the neighborhood rushed inside, their hair still damp with morning mist, loudly arguing over whose turn it was to shape the rabbit that day. The old woman ordered them to wash their hands, and they crowded one another at the sink before all 3 climbed onto stools around the table of dough. She gave each child a lump. She taught them how to roll the dough until it grew long, how to pinch out 2 ears, and how to use the tip of a toothpick to make 2 eyes. The youngest dropped the dough on the floor and screamed. The oldest sprinkled flour into the younger child's hair and received a light tap on the hand from the old woman's wooden spoon. Within moments, the entire kitchen had turned white, with flour clinging to cheeks, aprons, and even the old woman's nose, while laughter rose all the way to the ceiling. Delaney sat there watching, her hands still covered in dough, and allowed that laughter to flow through her. That evening, after returning to the mansion, she walked along the ground floor hallway to fetch a bottle of water for the old woman. The study door was slightly open, and light shone from within. She heard August's voice. He was speaking on the phone, still quietly, still with the same calm and measured rhythm of a man reading a menu aloud for a waiter to write down. She caught only a few fragments. No, don't leave anything behind. A silence followed. The car too. Then came another silence, a longer one. I don't care what his wife thinks. He should have thought about that before. Delaney stood motionless in the darkness of the hallway, the cold bottle of water in her hand, and a chill traveled down her spine. She stood there longer than she intended. Then the door opened fully, and August stood in the doorway with the phone still in his hand, looking at her. He didn't appear surprised, nor did he ask how much she had heard. He simply stepped back and opened the door wider. Come in, Miss Whitcomb. She entered. He closed the door, placed the phone on the desk, and turned the screen downward. Delaney still held the cold bottle of water in both hands. She had intended to offer some polite remark and withdraw, but what was rising inside her would no longer allow it. I once swore that I would save people, she said. He didn't answer. When I graduated, they made us stand and recite an oath. I still remember it. I remember how cold the floor felt that day. Her voice trembled, though not from fear. And now I sleep in your bed. I eat at your table. And you have just stood here telling someone not to leave anything behind. She raised her eyes to his. What am I in this house? August remained still for a moment. Then he pulled out a chair, but he didn't sit. He merely rested one hand against its back. You are right. She froze. What? You are right, he repeated. You are eating in the home of a man who gives orders to ruin other people. That is the truth. I am not going to argue with it. Delaney looked at him, and for a moment, she didn't know what to do with that answer. She had prepared herself for a justification. She had expected him to speak of honor, of how other people had forced his hand, of how the world beyond these walls was far worse. She had heard those speeches before, in other places, from other men. Aren't you going to explain? She asked. Explain what? He replied, and there was no anger in his voice, only weariness. "Do you want me to tell you about the man on that call? Then you will decide that he deserved it, and you will sleep a little better, and I will become a good man in your mind." "I won't do that." He removed his hand from the chair. "I am not a good man, Miss Whitcomb. I have never told anyone that I was. I only try not to become the worst among a gathering of bad men. That is the full extent of my ambition." He walked toward the window and turned his back to her. "There are things I don't do. I don't harm women. I don't harm children. I don't involve myself with the poison people inject into one another's arms. My father established those rules, and I keep them, and in this line of work, preserving even that much is enough to make people laugh at me." He was silent for a while. "But don't mistake those rules for morality. They are only a fence I built so I would always know where I was standing." Delaney looked at his back. "Does your mother know?" He didn't turn around. "She knows," he said. "She has known for a long time. She has never asked me a single question about it. She has also never told me she is proud of me." He raised a hand, drew the curtain aside, and looked out into the dark courtyard. "Every morning, she cooks for me. She places a plate in front of me, then gives me one look. Only one." He released the curtain and allowed it to fall. "That is my punishment, Miss Whitcomb. Living with that look every day. And I accept it. Don't think I don't understand what I am paying." The only sound remaining in the room was the pendulum clock in the hallway. Delaney placed the bottle of water on the edge of the desk. "I have to take this upstairs to her," she said. She turned away, her hand already resting on the doorknob. "Miss Whitcomb." She stopped. She turned back toward him. He was still standing in the same place beside the window, and he didn't speak for a long while, so long that she thought he had changed his mind. Then he said, "My mother wants apple pie tomorrow." Delaney remained there for a moment. Then she nodded, left the room, and closed the door, very gently behind her. Then the rainy season came, and the old woman began sleeping upstairs at the bakery again. No one could stop her. She said she had slept in that room since before her son knew how to walk, that she had no reason to abandon her own home and sleep as a guest in her son's house. And in the end, the only solution August could find was to have Delaney stay with her in the adjoining room. That night, Delaney woke because of the smell. It wasn't the smell of baking dough. It was scorched, leaving a bitter taste at the back of her tongue, and she sat upright before she even understood why. She opened the bedroom door, and a dense gray curtain struck her face. Smoke had filled the upstairs hallway. It rolled along the ceiling, thick and slow, swallowing the light from the night lamp at the far end of the corridor, and within her first 2 breaths, she could no longer see where the old woman's door was. Delaney dropped to the floor. She did what had to be done without thinking. Her hands remembered. She dragged herself into the small bathroom at the head of the hallway, soaked a bath towel with water, gave it a quick twist, then pressed it over her nose and mouth. Then she lowered herself as close to the floor as she could, her cheek nearly touching the boards where the air was still breathable, and began to crawl. She counted the doors. 1 door, 2 doors. The third was the old woman's room. Delaney pushed it open and found the woman sitting on the edge of the bed, both hands reaching blindly for the ash-gray cardigan hanging over the back of a chair, while long fits of coughing shook her body. "Get down on the floor," Delaney said, her voice muffled beneath the wet towel. "Come down here with me, ma'am. Right now." The old woman didn't understand. She continued reaching for the cardigan. Delaney pulled her down. She couldn't use much force because the splint had only recently been removed from her finger, and the pain in her chest was still there. But it was enough to make the woman slide from the edge of the bed and settle onto the floor. Delaney pressed the wet towel against her face. She intended to drag her into the hallway. She tried. She wrapped both arms beneath the woman's shoulders and pulled her about a handspan before the place inside her chest flared white and her entire left arm went weak. And she understood, with the stark and chilling clarity that comes to people in moments like that she couldn't do it. She didn't have the strength to carry the old woman down the stairs, so she had to do something else. She pulled the woman close to the base of the wall, where the smoke was thinnest, placed her on her side, then leaned over her to shield her from above. Delaney looked around and saw the small window in the outer wall. She seized the wooden chair beside the bed, forced all her weight into her uninjured arm, and struck. The glass shattered, and the rainy night air rushed inside in a stream of bitter cold, forcing the smoke to curl backward toward the ceiling. Delaney pressed the towel against the old woman's face. "Breathe with me. In through your nose. Slowly. That is right." She repeated those words over and over, She didn't know how many times, her eyes fixed upon the darkness beyond the broken window, and she kept the old woman breathing until she heard the sirens. They came from the head of the street, then filled the entire block, followed by the sound of a metal ladder striking the wall and boots running up the wooden stairs. A figure in heavy protective clothing appeared in the doorway, the light mounted on his helmet sweeping across her face, and a large arm reached forward to take the old woman. Delaney was carried downstairs afterward, though she couldn't clearly remember how. She remembered only sitting on the sidewalk with her back against the wheel of the fire engine while someone wrapped a silver blanket around her, and the firefighter standing before her removed his mask. He bent down and asked if she could breathe. She meant to nod. Then her gaze fell upon the patch sewn onto the shoulder of his coat. She knew that patch. She had once repaired it with black thread beneath the light of a desk lamp in the apartment on Ashland Street, because her husband had worn one corner thin and refused to have it mended. Company 14. The firefighter was staring at her, and his expression changed. He stepped back half a pace, then bent closer and studied her face. "Lainey?" he said. "Lainey Whitcomb?" She couldn't answer. "My God." He dropped into a crouch before her, bringing himself level with her face, and his voice broke. "Do you know how long we kept your photograph hanging at the firehouse? Right on the board beside the door? No one ever took it down." Delaney hadn't yet answered the firefighter when someone called out from beside the stretcher. She turned her head and saw something she had witnessed hundreds of times in her life and had never once grown accustomed to seeing. The chest beneath the silver blanket stopped moving. She was on her feet before she even realized she had risen. The blanket slipped from her shoulders and fell onto the wet sidewalk. She went to the stretcher, pushed aside an arm that reached out to stop her, and spoke 3 words to the paramedic, fumbling to open his equipment bag. "Let me do it." Then she dropped to her knees on the sidewalk, placed one palm over the other, locked her fingers together, and began. She counted aloud, steadily, 1 beat at a time, her voice hoarse from the smoke. But her rhythm never faltered once. Rain poured down her back, streamed along both arms, and dripped onto the pavement. She had counted her footsteps through all those seasons, so she wouldn't have to think, counted from the fire hydrant to the lamppost, from the lamppost to the bakery's back door, counted so she could cross the places she didn't dare pass through. Now she counted to keep someone from leaving. The same voice, the same rhythm. Men surrounded her. They stood in a circle, broad-shouldered, their dark coats soaked through. Men for whom the entire city moved aside, and not one of them could do anything. Bear stood closest, his enormous hands hanging at his sides, opening and closing. Tobias turned his face away, then looked back. They could do many things with their hands, and none of those things was of any use now. Then August arrived. He walked through the circle of men and stopped at the edge of the stretcher, looking down. Delaney continued counting. She didn't look up. "Mother?" he said. There was no response. Then the thing that had remained locked inside him for so many years broke free. "Don't!" His voice shattered on the first word. "Don't let anyone else die. Do you hear me? Don't let anyone else die." He raised his voice. He shouted in the middle of the street, beneath the rain, in front of all his men, and every one of them stood frozen, because no one in their lives had ever heard August Koval raise his voice, and now that they had, they wished they hadn't. Delaney kept counting. 2 more beats, 3 more beats. Then the chest beneath her hands rose once in a faltering gasp, then rose again, and the paramedic said 1 word, and Delaney collapsed back onto her heels, both hands trembling violently as she struggled for breath. The old woman was breathing again. 3 weeks later, in the salvage yard district on the western side of the city, Seamus Redgrave received an appointment he hadn't arranged. August came alone, walking into the center of the yard between mountains of scrap metal slick with rain, carrying nothing but an envelope tucked beneath his arm. He placed it on the lid of a steel drum in front of Redgrave. "You have occupied this land since I was still in school," he said. "This property is leased from the Port Authority. The lease expires this summer. 3 weeks ago, the next 40-year lease was transferred to another name." He tapped the envelope lightly with 2 fingers. "You aren't losing your property, Mr. Redgrave. The metal is still yours. The cranes are still yours." He turned away. "You are only losing the ground beneath your feet." The following morning, the man who had thrown the object that set the bakery on fire walked willingly into a federal building in downtown Baltimore and sat before 2 prosecutors. He gave them a name. On the drive home, Bear glanced toward the seat beside him. You really handed him over to the police? He asked. He won't survive a week. August looked through the window. I didn't give him to the police, he said. I gave him to the federal government, along with a place in the witness protection program, a new name, and a town in another state. He adjusted his shirt cuff, and the old watch with the scratched face appeared for a moment, before disappearing again. Redgrave can reach the police in this city. Redgrave can't reach the federal government. The old woman remained in the hospital for several days before being brought home, and during that time, Delaney began doing small chores around the house, partly because she couldn't bear sitting idle, and partly because she needed a reason to tell herself she was repaying something. One afternoon, she carried a stack of clean towels down to the ground floor study. The door was open, and no one was inside. She placed the towels on a low cabinet, then turned to leave, passing the desk on her way out. On its surface, leaning against the base of the lamp, was a small framed photograph that usually faced inward. Today it faced the room. Delaney looked at it. Then she stopped. Then she picked it up. The photograph showed a very young man with black hair, smiling broadly enough to show his teeth, one hand raised to shield his eyes from the sun. He wore a t-shirt, and there was a watch on his left wrist. Delaney looked at the watch first, then raised her eyes to the face, and cold traveled down both her arms. She knew that face. She had watched it through one long night in a brightly lit room on the 3rd floor of St. Bartholomew's Hospital. He had been brought in shortly before midnight, under a name she knew at once was false, and his record stated that he had no relatives. She had sat beside his bed at 4 o'clock in the morning because she was the only person free, and because he was the only patient in that ward. No one had come to visit. She set down the frame. Her hands were trembling. She left the room and walked along the hallway, where Bear stood at the far end speaking with someone. She went directly to him. The photograph on the desk, she said. Who is that young man? Bear turned around. He looked at her, and she saw the blood drain from his face, saw him swallow, saw him glance toward the staircase before looking at her again. Miss Whitcomb. Who is he? Bear couldn't answer, and the fact that he couldn't answer told her everything. Delaney went upstairs. She knocked on the door of the 2nd floor study and pushed it open without waiting. August stood beside the desk, a pen still in his hand. I know who your brother is, she said. He set down the pen. He wasn't angry. He didn't look like a man who had been caught, and that frightened her even more. He merely opened the bottom drawer, removed an old file with curled edges, and placed it on the desk between them. Read it, he said. Delaney opened the file. It contained copies of the medical records. She read quickly, her eyes moving over lines like thousands she had read throughout her life, and she saw the date, the time, the medication name, and the handwritten note from the physician on duty. Then she saw her own name. It appeared near the end in the incident report, neatly typed, and beside it were the words, medication stopped without authorization and against medical orders. Delaney stood motionless. She felt the floor shift slightly beneath her feet. You were looking for me, she said, her voice very quiet. Since that winter. Yes. What did you want with me? August didn't answer. He didn't lie, but neither did he say the words aloud, and the silence lasted long enough for her to understand. She stepped back half a pace. She thought about the nights she had slept in this house. She thought about the suit neatly folded on the chair. She thought about the night he had stood in the doorway of her room, something she learned only later when one of the household staff told her. What were you planning to do to me? She asked. He still didn't answer. Then he asked her one question, and it was the only question he asked during the entire conversation. Was he afraid? Delaney looked up. That night, he said. Was he afraid? She shook her head. He held my hand very tightly. August turned his face away. That night, after the old woman had fallen asleep, Delaney went downstairs before dawn. She took nothing with her. No clothes, no money, nothing from that house. She carried only the one thing no one could take from her, the thing that had remained after everything else had been taken away. A nurse's memory of every dose, every hour, and every number that appeared on the monitor that night. The clinic stood in a row of single-story buildings behind the salvage yard, its plastic sign hanging crooked, and its glass door covered with frosted film. Delaney pushed the door open shortly before noon. The man seated behind the desk looked up, and she recognized him immediately, even though his hair had turned completely gray and he had grown much thinner. Dr. Halloran recognized her at once. his eyes widening in shock. He sprang to his feet, knocking over the cup that held his pens. "You aren't supposed to be here." "That night," Delaney said, "the male patient who was admitted shortly before midnight under a false name. You prescribed a medication his readings showed he couldn't safely receive. I called you 3 times. You didn't answer. You picked up the 4th time and told me to follow the order." She placed both hands on the desk. "I stopped the medication. Then morning came, and my name appeared in the records, while yours did not." Halloran backed against the wall. His face had turned deathly pale. "You don't understand anything," he said. "I had no choice." "I know you didn't," she replied. "I only need you to tell me who took that choice away from you." At that moment, the rear door opened. An older man entered, his closely cropped hair streaked with gray, a wool coat covering his shoulders, and a file folder held in one hand. He stopped when he saw a stranger, then looked at Halloran, and Halloran almost seemed to shrink into himself. "Who is this?" the man asked. He didn't raise his voice. He merely asked, and Halloran's reaction told Delaney exactly who stood before her. Seamus Redgrave looked her over from head to toe, and there was nothing in his eyes, no recognition, no curiosity, only the glance someone might cast at a chair placed where it didn't belong. Then he set the file on the desk and opened it to search for some document. A Polaroid photograph slipped from between the pages and slid across the desktop toward Delaney. She looked down. It showed a small 2-story house on Ashland Street, photographed from across the road in the yellow light of late afternoon. A foreclosure notice had been posted on the door. On the front steps, slightly blurred because the camera had focused on the doorway, stood the figure of a woman holding a cardboard box against her chest. Redgrave picked up the photograph, looked at it, then looked at her. His eyes moved between them twice. "Ah," he said. That was all. He turned the photograph over. A handwritten line and a string of numbers appeared on the back. He read the words and nodded slowly. "Ashland Street," he said. "I remember this house. The 2nd-floor window leaked, so I had to lower the price." He tossed the photograph back onto the file. "But I don't remember you. Don't take it personally. You were only one line on a list." Delaney stood perfectly still. Something very cold and very flat was rising inside her, and it didn't feel like anger. It felt like clarity. "You foreclosed on that house in May," she said, her voice even. 3 weeks after I buried my daughter." Redgrave shrugged. He wasn't being cruel. That was the worst of it. He shrugged like a man being told about the weather in a city he had never visited. "Her name was Poppy," Delaney said. He looked up. "What?" "My daughter. Her name was Poppy. She weighed 4 pounds and 2 ounces when she was born." Delaney spoke slowly, shaping every word clearly, never raising her voice and never taking her eyes from his. "I know you won't remember. You have no reason to remember. But I need you to hear that name once with your own ears." The entire room fell silent. Halloran remained pressed against the wall, scarcely daring to breathe. "You can forget her the moment I leave this room," Delaney said. "But from this moment forward, you have heard her name. You can't take that back." Redgrave looked at her, and for the first time, something very slight passed across his face, before disappearing. He turned toward Halloran. "Who is this woman?" he asked again. And Halloran, panicking like a man who had lived too long beneath another person's shadow, blurted out, "She is with Koval." The words fell into the room like a stone dropping onto still water. Redgrave turned to look at her, and this time, he truly looked. He studied her the way someone might study a chess piece that had changed color on the board. "With Koval," he repeated. He gave a short laugh. "So he sent you here." Outside, tires ground across the gravel. Then came another vehicle. Then another. Halloran rushed to the window, pulled aside the frosted film, and when he turned back, every trace of color had vanished from his face. The telephone on the desk began to ring. No one answered. It rang a second time, then a third. Redgrave lifted his chin, and Halloran picked up the receiver with trembling hands, listened to a single sentence, then held it out as though offering something that was burning him. Redgrave took it and pressed it to his ear. The voice on the other end was very quiet, so quiet that he had to press the receiver harder against his ear to hear it. "Mr. Redgrave, there are several vehicles outside. Inside them are men who once worked for you." A silence followed. "I didn't bribe anyone. I don't have time for that. I asked them only one question. I asked who would lift you back up when you fell." Another silence came, longer this time. Not one of them could answer Mr. Redgrave. That is why I won 3 weeks ago. All that remains now is to open the door. Redgrave lowered the receiver very slowly. Then the door opened. Delaney would never be able to recount what happened afterward in the correct order. She remembered only that Tobias entered first, one step ahead and slightly to the side of August, as he always did, and she remembered Redgrave's hand slipping inside his wool coat. Then there was an explosion. Then everything slowed. Tobias remained standing for one more second, his eyes wide, his head tilted slightly, like a man who had just been asked a question he hadn't heard clearly. Then he sat down. He didn't collapse. He didn't fall. He lowered himself very slowly, his knees touching the floor first, like a man who had finally reached the end of a long shift and found somewhere to sit. Delaney was beside him before he touched the ground. She didn't remember how she crossed the room. Her hands worked on instinct, applying pressure to the wound as she whispered numbers under her breath, trying desperately to anchor him to the living. She had counted her footsteps through so many seasons to keep herself from thinking, and now she counted to keep someone from leaving. Tobias, look at me. Breathe with me. In through your nose. He looked at her. His eyes were still clear. Miss Whitcomb, he said. Don't speak. Save your strength. She continued counting. But there are moments when even the finest hands in the world are useful for only one thing, and Delaney recognized that moment when it arrived. She had known it during night shifts long ago. She stopped counting. She slipped her hand into his and held it tightly. Tell her, Tobias whispered. Tell her I won't go to collect her medicine anymore. Then he grew silent. Delaney continued holding his hand. When she looked up, Redgrave was lying face down on the floor. August stood directly over him, and in his hand was something he hadn't drawn until that moment. The entire room was silent. The men standing along the walls didn't move. No one intended to stop him. No one in this world would have tried to stop him in that moment. Delaney remained kneeling on the floor, still holding Tobias's hand, and she spoke. She said only one sentence. If you do this, you will become the very thing you have spent your entire life trying not to become. He didn't turn around. And I will have to remember you that way, she said, for the rest of my life. August stood motionless for a very long time. Then he lowered his hand. Seamus Redgrave was handed over to the federal authorities along with Halloran's testimony and every record the Koval family had managed to reconstruct. He received a long sentence. He didn't survive his first year inside, and no one in the Koval household asked why. Several weeks later, August's attorney arrived with a hard case containing backup drives and a collection of notarized statements. St. Bartholomew's Hospital had preserved years of hallway security footage for insurance purposes, and a retired nurse who had worked that night shift finally came forward to confirm Delaney's notes, admitting she had been bribed to stay silent back then. The truth pieced together from those two sources was simple enough to be cruel. Delaney, the nurse on duty, had read the numbers on the monitor, recognized that the medication couldn't safely be given, and called the attending physician. 4 calls. She had recorded the time of all 4 in her private notebook. That very medication was what had been killing the young man in the bed. Dr. Halloran had accepted money from the salvage yard district to do exactly one thing: sign an order and refuse to answer the telephone. When everything came apart, the hospital needed a name to place inside the empty space, and the cheapest name was always the name of the person working the night shift. August watched the footage alone in his study. There was no sound. Only slightly uneven black and white images captured by a camera mounted near the hallway ceiling and angled toward the room's doorway. He moved through many hours of emptiness. Then came the segment shortly before 4 o'clock in the morning. A nurse entered the room and left the door slightly open, and through that narrow space, the camera captured one corner of the bed. The nurse pulled a chair closer, sat down, and took the young man's hand. She remained that way for a long time. Then she bent toward him and said something. There was no sound, but in her statement, the retired nurse had written down the exact words because she had been standing just outside the door and had remembered them through all those years. Hold on. There is someone out there racing home to you. August turned off the screen. He sat in that dark room for a very long time, unable to say a word. 3 days later, the 2 young men were brought to the mansion. They weren't restrained, and no one touched them. They were led into a room where more than a dozen men stood along the walls, and a file of documents was already waiting on the table. August turned over each page and showed it to them. The mortgage papers for the pawn shop, owned by Trace Bidwell's family. Years of tax records that didn't reconcile. a list of everyone their families owed, the amounts, and the due dates. Trace Bidwell couldn't speak for a very long time. Kyler Dans trembled uncontrollably. Then August picked up the file, walked to the fireplace, and burned it before their eyes. "I won't touch your families," he said, "not because you deserve that mercy." He brushed his hands clean, but because that morning, a woman lay on the wet bricks at the market and did something kind when no one in this world required her to do it. If she could do that, then so can I. Then he turned toward the door. "Miss Whitcomb." Delaney entered. She stood there leaning on her cane, and everyone in the room turned toward her. "You were the person they hurt," August said. "You decide." She studied the two young men for a long time. "The most frightening thing that morning wasn't being pushed," she said. "It was that 20 people stood there watching. They didn't do anything to me. They simply didn't see me as a human being," she continued. "Delete that video, then record another one. In it, you will clearly state the old woman's full name, Mrs. Rosa Koval, and explain that she lives with memory loss. You will also say that the woman who stood between you and her was once an emergency room nurse at St. Bartholomew's Hospital." She looked directly at Trace. "Let people know that we both have names." Then she added one final condition. "And 6 months of unpaid work at the nursing home on Chase Street. There you will have to learn how to feed someone who can no longer remember their own name." Winter came early that year, and Mrs. Rosa grew weaker very quickly, with the quiet fading of those who have lived their full measure of life and have nothing left to hurry toward. She still rose early, still insisted on going down to the kitchen, still asked whether anyone had ordered bread that day. Then, one morning near the end of December, she took Delaney's hand while she slept, and she never awakened again. Her hand remained warm for a long time afterward. The family attorney arrived the following week carrying a stack of papers yellowed along the edges. Mrs. Rosa had written her will many years earlier, before her memory had begun to falter, and in those documents, the name of the person who would inherit the bakery had been left blank. A sealed envelope was attached, with instructions that it could be opened only after her death. Inside was a single handwritten page. "I am not leaving this bakery to my son. He doesn't need it. He already has far more than I ever did. I leave it to the person who steps forward when I fall. If no one has stepped forward by then, sell it, give away every dollar, and keep nothing." Delaney read those words again and again. The old woman had written them before she knew that someone named Delaney Whitcomb existed in this world. She had set a condition and sent it into the future. And many years later, on a rainy and windswept Saturday morning at Fells Point Market, the future had answered her. That afternoon, August called Delaney into his study. He didn't sit down. He reached beneath his shirt cuff and removed the old watch with the scratched face, the watch she had seen on his wrist since that afternoon at the market, and placed it on the desk before her. "People believe this watch belonged to my father," he said. "I let them believe that." He pushed it a little closer to her. "It belonged to my brother. He was wearing it when he was admitted to the hospital. Afterward, they returned it to me in a plastic bag with his wallet and his house keys." He cleared his throat. "You kept him alive for one more season, Miss Whitcomb. Because of that season, I had enough time to fly home. I was able to sit beside my brother's bed. I was able to say goodbye to him." He turned away slightly. "You gave that to me. I spent all those years looking for you, and I was looking for the wrong reason." In the spring, the bakery opened again. Bear climbed a ladder to hang a small wooden sign in the corner of the front window, and he did it with great care, measuring repeatedly to make certain it hung straight. Several lines had been carved into the wood by hand. Poppy's Corner, free coffee and bread, no explanation needed, no thanks required. On the first morning, the neighborhood children rushed inside as they always had, competing for places around the dough table, and the youngest child, holding a loaf still warm from the oven, pointed toward the sign in the window. "Who is Poppy, ma'am?" Delaney wiped her hands on her apron. She bent until she was level with the child and smiled. "Poppy was a very remarkable little girl," she said. "She taught me how to love other people. Now eat before your bread grows cold." Delaney straightened, and through the window, she saw August standing across the street with both hands in his coat pockets, waiting. She poured him a cup of coffee and stepped outside. "In the beginning you kept me there because of a debt," she said. "In the beginning, yes. And now?" He accepted the cup of coffee. "Now it is because every morning I want to know that you are all right." Delaney Whitcomb had once believed that the world had erased her name, but the world hadn't forgotten. It had only been waiting for someone to speak it again. And in the end, the person who restored her name was Delaney herself. This story leaves us with one very simple truth. A person's dignity doesn't reside in their home address, in the clothes they wear, or in whether they are standing or lying on the ground. Everyone has a name, and everyone has once been the most precious person in someone else's life. Kindness doesn't have to wait until we have more than enough to give. And sometimes, what we offer when we have the least becomes the very thing that returns to save our own life. Stepping forward only once can be enough to change everything. If today's story touched your heart, please press the like button, share this video with the people you love, and subscribe to our channel so we can listen together each day to more meaningful stories. How do you feel about Delaney and Mrs. Rosa? What part of their story will remain with you the longest? Please leave a few words in the comments. We sincerely hope to hear the feelings that come from the deepest place in your heart. We wish you and your family abundant health, peace, and happiness every day. Goodbye. And we look forward to seeing you again in our next video.